Founding member, former chair and current events director of Dublin Cycling Campaign, and also a certified bicycle policy auditor and qualified road safety auditor and qualified cycle training instructor. I'm hoping to get you in, Damien, to Leinster House to train Oireachtas members in safe cycling. Although, of course, it's more about the Oireachtas members who should be trained in safe driving, as we've heard. Damien has over 15 years' experience in transport policy planning and research, and is currently investigating the wider social effects of introducing the Dublin bike scheme here in Trinity as part of a PhD. So I'll ask Damien to come up.
Okay, good morning everyone. I hope everyone's shoes and socks have dried out and you're all comfortable there. Maybe just to start off, who travelled from outside of Ireland to come to the conference? Maybe put your hands up. Okay, you're all very welcome. And who travelled from outside of Dublin to get here today? Okay, you're also very welcome. Thanks a million to our former Minister, Ciarán Cuffe, for giving a great overview of what's been happening over the last few years. My own role in the Dublin Cycling Campaign, I do little bits of everything, but essentially I'm part of a wider team which is trying to change Dublin City. A little bit more background on the campaign. We've been around for nearly 20 years. A lot of our work is behind the scenes, and as Ciarán said, there's been a shift, I guess, from more guerrilla tactics from 20 years ago, a lot more street protests, painting potholes while out in cycles, whereas now a lot of our work is research. What's best practice when you're trying to change your city? How do you change attitudes amongst decision makers? What are good policies? So there's a ridiculously strong work ethic in the cycling campaign, and there's a very good, openness to good ideas from abroad. So just at this point, I want to thank Mike McKillen particularly for driving things along, and Will Andrews, who isn't here today, he's in New Zealand for personal reasons. So that's just by way of introduction. Dublin Cycling Campaign, thankfully, we're part of a network of campaigning organisations around Ireland now. There's strong groups in Waterford, Cork, Limerick, Galway, Sligo, Skerries, Maynooth, Naas, and some other spots around the country, Kilkenny. So it's not just, I think what's happened over the last 20 years is that it's not just a small core group who are trying to change the culture. There's a widespread recognition that the existing paradigm doesn't work. It doesn't work for the energy reasons, climate change, social reasons. We need to change our cities. So collectively in the campaign, we're trying to combine our energies and change the cities. And I'm delighted that cyclist.ie is now part of the European Cyclist Federation, which is connecting up with groups around Europe. Again, this image is just to show pictorially how the campaign works. A lot of it is behind the scenes research at a national level, and then at a local level plugging into the different local authorities, Dublin City, Fingal, South Dublin, etc. It's not all about serious submissions. We also put a lot of work into events, both social events and conferences like this, and at each of our monthly meetings we have presentations from various figures. Okay, so I guess what I want to explore briefly is how do we recreate the bicycle culture in Dublin? And maybe just initially, what is the bicycle culture? Why is it important? And maybe the easiest way to illustrate it is to show the car culture that developed in Ireland, particularly over the last 10 to 15 years. And this image here, I think it captures a lot of what, where the thinking went and where behaviour went over the last 15 years. And poor young Johnny couldn't get to school just up the road because there was a quarter of an inch of snow, and it was going to be difficult to drive up there, even this amazing vehicle. So there was a kind of crazy change in behaviour and values and thinking over the last 15 years. And I think hopefully that's going to begin to change, and there's some positive signs, particularly from the public bike scheme. Let me see now. This statistic, it's shocking and amazing. In 1986, in the year of the census, there were 24,000 primary school children cycling to school. In 2006, only 4,000. And in that same census period, there were more women driving to secondary school, driving themselves to secondary school, than there were cycling to school. So something crazy happened. Cycling was no longer normal. It was something fringe. It was something outside of what should be happening. I think what we need to create is a situation where cycling is normal. Again, if you head to a lot of the northern European countries that Ciarán mentioned, when the schools open, or the schools close at least, there are literally floods of cyclists, tens, hundreds of them. And thankfully, there are a few schools in Dublin, particularly where the Green Schools have been working, where this is the case again. And I'm looking forward to hearing Ali's talk later on today. What's happened at the moment, it's mainly, as Ciarán referred to, it's mainly men of a particular age who make up most of the cyclists in Dublin. There are 1 in 4 women cycling, very few older cyclists, very few young, and we need to change that. Of course, it's not just cycling by itself. For the longer trips, as Dublin has expanded and as other cities around Ireland and Europe have expanded, for the longer trips, it's about combining the bicycle with the bus, with the tram, with the metro, with the train. And I took this image in Munich a few years ago, and it seemed fascinating that you could take your bike on the subway in Munich, but you couldn't do it in Dublin for some extraordinary reason. So in the campaign, we were particularly delighted when Minister Cuff introduced a very simple change that means you can jump on the dart with your bike now. Okay, so maybe just why does it matter? Why is it so important to introduce a bicycle culture? Sometimes we skip over thinking about policies. Why is it important? Well, for me, this image here, it's a sculpture in a city in the Netherlands, and it expresses the simplicity of the type of city we want when we put the bicycle first. It's the social benefits of having more bicycles in the city. You can stop, you can have chats with people on the street. It's really easy, it's really natural. It's building up social capital. And if you're in a bus, it's actually very difficult to jump out for 1 minute, then jump back on. You simply can't do it in a car. And I think the social benefits of cycling are undervalued and understated. There are multiple economic arguments, and I think we're going to explore them in some of the other sessions today, but it's a really efficient use of finite space in a city. It's a cheap way to move people around, and in terms of the number of bikes you can fit in one car parking space, it's maybe 8 or 10 or even 20 times, depending if you go for multi-storey bike parking. Okay, so that's just almost by way of setting the scene. How do we change the city? How do we recreate the bike culture? This graph here, some of you might have seen it before. It gives a long-term historical overview of the development, the growth of cycling over the last century. And just a few points to pick up. Initially, the bicycle in the late 1800s, it was really a plaything of the rich. And it was only in the 1920s, 30s, 40s that there was the mass democratization of the bicycle. Everyone used the bike to get around. In the 1950s, 60s and into 70s, this was the period of the growth of ownership of cars in European cities. It was also the time you had the growth of suburbs and a lot of traffic policies, which Ciarán mentioned, which facilitated the free flow movement of cars, overpasses, underpasses, gyratories, giant roundabouts, even bigger roundabouts, and even bigger roundabouts still. Cities became awful places to cycle. So what happened then in the 70s and 80s, particularly in the denser European cities, is that it dawned on them there was massive congestion. Cities stopped functioning. Road traffic fatalities went up dramatically. And this, with the oil crisis in the 70s, there prompted a shift in thinking. Policymakers realised we cannot go on doing the same. So from about the 1970s and 80s onwards, there was a change in policy, and then in the 90s and the year 2000s, we saw the growth in cycling numbers. So the point of this graph is that if policymakers do shift all of the policies that are out there, it does take a decade or two for it to kick in. So the policies we introduce now, it'll be in the 2020s, 2030s, 2040s that we're going to see them come into fruition. Okay, so how do we actually change it? I have 3 main points in the presentation. The first one, to change the culture, we need a wide package of measures. There's no one single intervention that's going to change our towns and cities into being bicycle friendly. It's a whole breadth, a whole array of interventions. And I think a lot of them are captured in the 2009 National Cycle Policy Framework. There's over 100 actions in it, but my slight fear is that there doesn't appear to be an implementation plan. A strategy or plan without an implementation strategy is as good as nothing. It needs to be set out year by year, what's going to happen, who's doing it, are there people there to implement it? And the absence of the cycling officer in Dublin City Council is a huge blow to this. Every councillor in the country needs more cycling officers, and indeed every traffic person, planner, engineer needs to be thinking bike. So this is one of the critical points I want to make. The second point, you've lots of possible things lots of interventions to introduce, but which ones do you prioritise? In the cycling campaign, we believe the starting point is to remember that a bicycle is a vehicle, both in international law and in Irish law. A bicycle and a rider is entitled to be on the streets, so therefore the primary priority should be to make those streets bicycle friendly. The hierarchy of measures is a useful concept to help us think this through. So rather than jumping in and immediately providing cycle lanes and cycle tracks and cycleways, the first intervention should be speed reduction, as Kieran mentioned, particularly around schools, particularly in the city centre, particularly in residential areas. Traffic calming, big point, removal of the multi-lane one-way streets. I don't know how many times I hear people saying, if only I could get, say, for example, from Grafton Street to Marion Road without having to take a crazy, ridiculous, circuitous detour. There's really simple interventions such as putting in contraflows that will make routes more direct, more permeable, etc. I think if anyone has any doubt about the logic underpinning the need to introduce 30 kph speed limits, for me this graph says everything. And maybe I think in terms of graphs, but if you're hit at 50 kph as a pedestrian or a cyclist, you have an 80% chance of not surviving. If you're hit at 30 kilometres per hour, you have a 90% chance of surviving. And this is backed up, really good stats, really good research underpinning this. And remember at a conference years ago, a Swedish traffic engineer explaining this, and this was why a lot of Swedish towns were introducing lower speed limits, and it's only now kicking in other places. I think we need to acknowledge that on most streets there currently isn't dedicated cycling facilities. There won't necessarily be room for them, and they may not necessarily be the best intervention there. Having a proper overtaking distance for cyclists is essential, and just a few images here. The yellow one in the top, that Mayo County Council produced that signpost a few years ago. Very simple, very effective. And in the bottom left-hand side, there's an image of a bus in Christchurch in New Zealand, and they've gone so far as to have a big billboard, a mobile billboard on the back of the bus to say, give cyclists this much room. And I would love to see, for example, on every single Dublin bus, have this on the back. It would send out a strong signal that cyclists need room. And I mean, the reason for this is, with the poor quality of some of the sections of road, cyclists need to wobble. They need to wobble and avoid potholes. It's really difficult to do that with one hand looking back, signalling, and with traffic moving right beside you. And I think when policymakers don't cycle, they don't necessarily understand this subtle but important point. And we often hear a lot about the Netherlands and Denmark and segregated cycling facilities. They do work very well over there, but it's really a word of caution about the difficulty of transposing one engineering solution into a different culture when you have a different legislative regime, a different driving culture, and a different cycling culture. It's not quite as straightforward as you think. Culture matters. In this next slide, this was again in the centre of Copenhagen. You have a cyclist going straight ahead, you have a vehicle waiting to turn right, and the driver waits very patiently, very attentively while the cyclist goes on. This works in Copenhagen. You can't just helicopter it over here and expect it to work. Culture matters. I think creating a critical mass of cyclists, one of the beauties of the Dublin bike scheme is that it has got a lot of people on bikes who currently otherwise wouldn't be doing it. They're doing it for all sorts of reasons. It's convenience, it's fear of bicycle theft, it connects up with public transport, and we've all seen a lot of people who otherwise wouldn't be on bikes using it. So that's helping to create the critical mass, and a proven way to make streets safe is to have more cyclists on it. Drivers expect to see cyclists more, and if you're a driver yourself, you're probably also a cyclist, at least some of the time. Okay, one of my final points, it's changing the image of cycling. I think too often in the media, too often everywhere else, the image is of lycra-clad guys racing along, head down, no interaction with anything. And I think we need to think differently about who we're trying to target. We need more women cycling, and I know other people, particularly Anne and some other speakers, are going to explore this more in the conference. Kudos to Dublin City Council for running the Cycle Chic show in City Hall a few years ago. I think it does help, prompt people to think a little bit differently about who the cyclist is. Again, just another inspiring image for me is going to the train stations in some of the northern European cities. This is in Leuven in the north of Belgium. Casually 5,000 or 6,000 bikes on either side of the train station, and it's normal, it's everyday. And if we're trying to change the culture, it's about making this normal here. So I think Kieran's idea of having, a stylishly designed multi-storey bicycle park outside Euston Station to mirror that one in Amsterdam, which incidentally was designed by an Irish architect, I think it would be fitting to invite him over here and design maybe one at Connolly as well, and sure, bus Aaron while he's at it. Okay, my last main point is that we know the policies that do make the difference. We do know the ones which need to be prioritised, but in order for anything to happen, it needs political commitment. This isn't just ministers in Department of Transport, it cuts across all of the different departments, it cuts across multiple local authority departments as well. I was delighted to see this photo up on the European Cyclists Federation website. This was a transport meeting in Leipzig in Germany a few weeks ago. So it is good to see the minister on a bike, normal clothes, doesn't have all of the protective multiple layers, and it's helping to normalise cycling. As the former cycling officer in Dublin City Council used to say, it should be like brushing your teeth. You don't really discuss it. You just jump on your bike, you brush your teeth every day, you cycle every day. It's part of your normal routine. And again, it's not just ministerial leadership, it's a lot of meetings, a lot of behind the scenes work. This is a meeting between Dublin City Council, Dublin Cycling Campaign, the Lord Mayor and Dublin City Council's offices a few years ago. So just to finish, I was delighted yesterday, I was reading the English Times online, and there's an interview with Mark Cavendish. He's one of the sports cyclists, and his main message was that if we're trying to make cities more bicycle friendly, there's an onus on drivers to pay more attention to cyclists. He was looking at the strict liability legal system which they have in the Netherlands and in Denmark, which means that the drivers are automatically liable in incidences with cyclists, and this changes driver behaviour. You're much more cautious, and I was delighted to see someone from the sports community pushing this message. I think for a long time it's been the campaigners who are really pushing this. I'd like to see the wider cycling community dovetailing with a lot of the messages that we're promoting. Okay, so just to conclude, 3 main points. To change culture, you need to implement a wide package of measures. There's no one single intervention that changes things. We need to prioritise those interventions, and it's reminding ourselves that the cyclist is entitled to be on the road and making the road safer, not just with dedicated infrastructural interventions, but with behavioural ones as well. And the third point is that to create any type of change, and I think the introduction of the public bikes with Lord Mayor Montague pushing it is a good example. It needs political commitment. And as we had a lecture here last year by Philip Darnton, and I thought the title of his talk was great. It was Taking Cycling Seriously. Are we really serious? And I think if we're going to change Dublin and we're going to get up to 10% of trips by bike, we need to take it a lot more seriously than we do at the moment. Thanks a million.